I'm Victoria Bennett, 29 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I wanted nothing more than to make my parents proud. I dreamed that my wedding day would be the moment they'd finally look at me with genuine happiness, the day they'd celebrate me without comparisons or conditions. I imagined my father walking me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, my mother fussing over my dress with love and care. Instead, what I got was a nightmare I never saw coming. On what should have been the most beautiful day of my life, my parents orchestrated a humiliation so profound that it left me standing in my wedding gown, mortified in front of everyone I cared about. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They hired strippers, actual strippers, to crash my elegant black tie reception, and then told every single guest that I had requested this spectacle myself. They announced it proudly, as if they were indulging some wild fantasy of mine, when the truth was they had engineered the entire disaster to punish me for not being the child they wanted. As those performers walked through the doors of the bell tower, as the music shifted and gasps filled the room, I watched my carefully planned celebration crumble into chaos. My heart didn't just break in that moment. It shattered into pieces so small I wasn't sure I'd ever put them back together. The looks on my guests' faces, the confusion, the judgment, the shock, all of it crashed over me like a tidal wave. And through it all, I saw my parents standing in the corner, drinks in hand, satisfied smirks playing at their lips like they'd just won some twisted game. That night, as I stood there drowning in shame that wasn't even mine to carry, something inside me finally snapped. I realized that if I didn't take control of my own story, if I didn't draw a line so bold it couldn't be crossed, I would spend the rest of my life being nothing more than their disappointment, their punching bag, their eternal scapegoat. Growing up in Franklin, Tennessee, just outside Nashville, meant living in a world where appearances were currency and reputation was everything. My parents, Richard and Patricia Bennett, built their entire existence around what other people thought. Our home was a two-story colonial with white columns, and a lawn so perfectly manicured it looked like it belonged in a magazine. Every holiday, Patricia would hang wreaths that matched the season exactly, and Richard made sure our cars were always spotless, always new enough to impress the neighbors. Inside that picture-perfect house, there was a hierarchy, and I was never at the top of it. My older brother Marcus held that position from the day he was born. He was everything they had ever wanted in a child. Ambitious, conventionally successful, driven in ways they understood and could brag about. By the time he was in high school, Richard and Patricia were already telling their country club friends about his future at Vanderbilt, about how he'd climb the corporate ladder and make the Bennett name mean something in Nashville's business community. Me, I was the daughter who never quite fit the mold they'd created. While Marcus excelled at economics and business classes, memorizing profit margins and market trends, I was drawn to creativity and connection. I started a blog when I was 15, back when social media was just beginning to explode, and I fell in love with the way words and images could tell stories that resonated with people. I taught myself graphic design through online tutorials, spent hours crafting posts that balanced authenticity with aesthetic appeal, and slowly built a following of people who actually cared what I had to say. To me, it was magical. I was creating something from nothing, connecting with strangers who became friends, building a community around shared interests and genuine conversation. To Richard and Patricia, it was a waste of time. They saw my laptop screen glowing late into the night and called it laziness. They looked at my growing follower count and dismissed it as narcissism. When I tried to explain that social media marketing was becoming a real career path, that brands were paying people for the exact skills I was developing, Richard just shook his head and told me to focus on something practical. I still remember the day I showed Patricia a campaign I'd created for a local boutique. I was 16, and the shop owner had reached out after seeing my blog, asking if I'd promote her new collection in exchange for store credit. I put together a series of posts with original photography, clever captions, and strategic hashtags. Within a week, she told me her sales had tripled. I was so proud. I printed out the analytics, the comments from customers who said they'd come in because of my posts, and I brought it all to Patricia while she was arranging flowers in the kitchen. She glanced at the papers for maybe 3 seconds before setting them aside and saying, "That's nice, Victoria. But you should really be thinking about your college applications. Marcus just got accepted into the business honors program. Did I tell you? That became the soundtrack of my childhood. Marcus achieved something, and the world stopped spinning. I achieved something, and it was background noise, quickly forgotten in favor of whatever my brother had done that week. When I was 12, I won a photography contest through my middle school. My submission was a series of candid shots I'd taken around Franklin, capturing moments that most people walked past without noticing. An elderly man feeding birds in the park, a little girl jumping in puddles with pure joy on her face, morning light filtering through the trees along the Harpeth River. The judges praised my eye for emotion and composition, and I won first place out of nearly 200 entries. I came home clutching the ribbon and certificate, my heart racing with the hope that maybe this time, my parents would see me. Richard barely looked up from his newspaper. Patricia was on the phone with her sister, and when I tried to show her, she held up one finger to silence me and kept talking. That night at dinner, Marcus mentioned he'd been selected for the debate team captain position, and suddenly there was champagne, congratulations, discussions about how this would look on his college applications. My photography award never made it to the wall. Meanwhile, Marcus's trophies, certificates, and medals covered an entire shelf in the living room, spotlit like a museum exhibit. The pattern repeated itself through every stage of my life. When Marcus got his driver's license, Richard bought him a nearly new sedan and spent an entire weekend teaching him maintenance basics, talking to him like an equal, like someone whose time and interests mattered. When I got my license a year later, Patricia handed me the keys to her old car, the one with the temperamental air conditioning and the scratch on the passenger door, and told me not to bother them unless it was an emergency. Marcus went to football games with Richard, bonding over sports and strategy. I asked Patricia once if we could go to a blogging conference in Memphis, just the two of us, a chance to connect over something I cared about. She said she didn't have time for silly internet hobbies and suggested I join her book club instead, where they read novels she chose and discussed them according to her interpretations. I went once, sat quietly while the women talked over me, and never went back. High school magnified everything. Marcus was at Vanderbilt by then, sending home stories of fraternity parties, networking events, internship offers. Every Sunday dinner became a Marcus update session. Richard would pour wine and ask him about classes, about which professors were worth knowing, about what firms were recruiting on campus. Patricia would beam with pride, interjecting with comments about how she'd always known he was destined for greatness. I'd sit at that table, pushing food around my plate invisible. When I tried to share that I'd landed a paid partnership with a regional clothing brand, that they were actually compensating me for my content creation, Richard cut me off mid-sentence to ask Marcus about his economics thesis. Patricia didn't even pretend to listen. She was already planning Marcus's graduation party in her head, talking about which country club ballroom to reserve, which caterer impressed people the most. There was one person who saw me during those years, and that was my English teacher, Mrs. Ellen Rodriguez. She noticed that I'd started a lifestyle blog and asked to see it. I was hesitant at first, afraid of more dismissal, but she insisted. The next day, she pulled me aside and told me my writing was engaging, my visual aesthetic was professional, and I had a real talent for authentic communication. She encouraged me to apply to colleges with strong communications and marketing programs, to see my passion as a legitimate career path rather than a frivolous hobby. She wrote me a recommendation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Recommendation letter that I still have saved, one that described me as innovative, entrepreneurial, and ahead of my time. When I got accepted to the University of Tennessee with a partial scholarship to their communications school, Mrs. Rodriguez was the only adult in my life who celebrated. My parents' response was a lukewarm, "Well, I suppose that's fine, though business would have been more practical." College was freedom. I moved to Knoxville and finally felt like I could breathe. I declared a major in marketing and digital media, dove into classes about consumer behavior, brand strategy, and content creation. My professors recognized that the skills I'd been building since 15 weren't just hobbies, they were the future of advertising and communication. I took on internships with local startups, managing their social media accounts and watching engagement rates climb because of strategies I implemented. I built portfolios, won student awards for campaign designs, and graduated with honors. Through all of it, I sent updates to Richard and Patricia. Photos of me at networking events, screenshots of successful campaigns, news about job offers. Their responses were always the same. Brief, detached, followed immediately by news about Marcus, who by then had his MBA and was climbing the ranks at a corporate firm in Atlanta. He'd bought a condo, was dating Stephanie Wright, a lawyer from a well-connected family, and Richard and Patricia acted like they'd personally orchestrated his success. After graduation, I landed a position at Horizon Creative Group, a respected marketing agency in Nashville. I started as a junior strategist and worked relentlessly, staying late to perfect presentations, volunteering for challenging accounts, proving myself in an industry that moved at lightning speed. Within 3 years, I was promoted to marketing director, leading a team of creatives and managing six-figure accounts for major clients. My campaigns won regional awards. I was featured in a Nashville Business Journal article about young professionals shaping the city's creative economy. I was making a name for myself, building something real and impressive. I sent the article to my parents, hoping that maybe this concrete, undeniable success would finally earn their respect. Richard texted back, "Saw the article. Marcus just closed a $2 million deal. Talk soon." Patricia didn't respond at all. It was during one of those late nights at Horizon, hunched over a campaign pitch for a new client, that I met Daniel Hayes. He'd come in for a consultation about rebranding his high school's extracurricular programs, something the principal had approved a small budget for. Daniel was a history teacher at a public school in East Nashville, and from the moment he walked into the conference room, I felt something shift. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wore a slightly wrinkled button-down, spoke passionately about giving his students better opportunities, and listened when I talked, actually listened, like my words held value. We worked together on that project for 2 months, meeting weekly to refine messaging and design. He'd ask questions about my process, compliment my ideas, push back thoughtfully when he had different perspectives. It was the first time in my life someone treated my work like it mattered, not because it made them look good, but because it was genuinely worth respecting. Our professional relationship shifted into something personal, so naturally I barely noticed it happening. Coffee meetings turned into dinners. Work conversations evolved into talks about our lives, our dreams, our frustrations. Daniel told me about losing his father young, about his mother Linda working 2 jobs to keep him in school, about deciding to become a teacher because he wanted to be the person who saw potential in kids others overlooked. I told him about Richard and Patricia, about growing up invisible next to Marcus's spotlight, about the ache of never being enough. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me I was being dramatic. He just said, "That sounds really lonely, and I'm sorry you experienced that." Those simple words, that basic acknowledgement, meant more than he could have known. We started dating officially when I was 26. Daniel introduced me to his mother Linda and his stepfather Robert within the first month, and the difference was staggering. Linda hugged me like I was already family, asked about my work with genuine curiosity, remembered details from previous conversations. Robert, who managed a hardware store and had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen, treated me with a warmth and respect I'd never received from Richard. When I showed them a campaign I was proud of, they asked thoughtful questions, celebrated my creativity, made me feel seen. Dating Daniel meant experiencing what healthy family dynamics looked like, and it was both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because I finally understood what I'd been missing. Painful because it highlighted just how abnormal my own family was. Through Daniel, I also reconnected with my cousin Kevin, someone I'd barely seen since childhood because Richard and Patricia had distanced themselves from that side of the family years ago. Kevin reached out after seeing my name in the Nashville Business Journal article, wanting to congratulate me. We met for lunch, and he shared perspectives about our family that validated everything I'd felt, but had been taught to dismiss. He told me he'd watched Richard and Patricia favor Marcus his entire life, that extended family members had commented on it for years, that even as kids, he'd felt bad for me. Having someone from within the family acknowledge the favoritism was both validating and heartbreaking. Kevin became a friend after that, someone who understood the context without needing lengthy explanations. My career continued to flourish. I was recruited by a competing agency with a higher salary offer, but Horizon matched it and gave me more creative control. I led campaigns for major brands, spoke on panels about digital marketing trends, mentored younger strategists. My professional life was everything I'd worked for, proof that my teenage passion hadn't been frivolous. I had my own apartment in East Nashville, a neighborhood filled with artists, musicians, and creatives who valued authenticity over appearances. I'd built a life I was proud of, surrounded by people who chose to be there. Daniel and I moved in together after a year of dating, and for the first time, home felt like a place of peace rather than performance. I kept my parents informed, still harboring some stubborn hope that eventually, they'd acknowledge me. I invited them to an awards ceremony where I was receiving recognition for a campaign that had gone viral, bringing a local nonprofit national attention and tripling their donations. Patricia said they had a country club event they couldn't miss. Richard didn't respond at all. Marcus called me once during that period, rare enough that I answered immediately. I thought maybe he was reaching out to connect, but instead, he wanted advice on how to improve Stephanie's law firm's social media presence. He said he'd heard I was good at that stuff, asked if I could do it for free since we were family, then spent 20 minutes talking about his upcoming promotion. When I suggested he pay me my standard consulting rate, he laughed like I'd made a joke and said family shouldn't charge family. I told him I'd think about it, and never brought it up again. Daniel proposed on a walk along the Cumberland River, the sun setting behind the Nashville skyline, turning the water gold and pink. He didn't make a big production of it, just stopped on the pedestrian bridge, took my hand, and told me I was the person who made him believe in building a future. He said he wanted to spend every day proving I was worth celebrating, worth seeing, worth loving exactly as I was. The ring was simple and perfect, and when I said yes, I meant it with my whole heart. We called our families that evening. Linda cried happy tears, Robert congratulated us warmly, and they immediately started talking about helping with wedding plans. When I called Patricia, she said, "Oh well, I suppose that's nice," and then launched into an update about Marcus and Stephanie looking at houses. Richard got on the line briefly, muttered something about hoping I was sure and hung up. No congratulations. No joy. Just the familiar wall of indifference. Despite everything, despite years of proof that they didn't care, I still wanted them at my wedding. Some part of me, the little girl who'd once dreamed of making them proud, couldn't let go of the hope that this milestone would be different. Daniel understood. Even though he'd seen how they treated me, he held me when I cried about it, telling me that hoping for their love didn't make me weak, it made me human. So I sent them formal invitations, hand-designed by me, to a wedding I'd been planning with Amanda Collins, my best friend from college who'd become a successful wedding planner. Amanda knew my family history and had gently suggested maybe not inviting Richard and Patricia would save me heartache, but I couldn't do it. I had to give them one more chance. The wedding was planned for the Bell Tower, an elegant venue in downtown Nashville with exposed brick, vaulted ceilings, and massive windows overlooking the city. I'd envisioned something sophisticated and warm, with string lights, natural greenery, a live band playing jazz standards. Black tie optional, intimate but beautiful, a celebration that reflected who Daniel and I actually were. Amanda helped me coordinate every detail, from the caterer to the florist to the photographer. Daniel's mother Linda insisted on making the desserts herself, a gesture so loving it made me cry. My chosen family, the people who'd shown up for me time and again, poured themselves into making the day special. I sent my parents the full itinerary, followed up with calls, even offered to help arrange their travel from Franklin, though it was barely 30 minutes away. Patricia confirmed they'd be there. Richard said he wouldn't miss it, though his tone suggested otherwise. The morning of my wedding arrived with perfect October weather, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes Nashville look like a postcard. I woke up in a hotel suite surrounded by Amanda, my bridesmaids, and Linda, who'd insisted on being there to help me get ready. The energy was light and happy, champagne and mimosas flowing while we laughed over hair and makeup. Amanda kept checking her massive planning binder, ensuring every vendor was on schedule, every timeline was precise. She'd been my rock through the entire planning process, and watching her orchestrate everything with such care made me emotional. This woman, who'd been my friend since we'd met in a freshman communications class, had poured her heart into making my day perfect. Linda bustled around making sure everyone had eaten, adjusting my veil with gentle hands, telling me I looked like a dream. These women, my chosen family, made me feel loved in ways Richard and Patricia never had. The ceremony itself was everything I'd hoped for. Daniel stood at the altar in his tuxedo, and when I walked down the aisle, the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. Robert walked me down, having offered when it became clear Richard's presence was uncertain at best. Robert treated the honor with such respect and tenderness that I didn't even miss my father in that moment. The vows Daniel and I exchanged were personal and heartfelt, written by us, promising partnership and unwavering support. When the officiant pronounced us married and Daniel kissed me, the room erupted in genuine celebration. Looking out at our guests, I saw friends, colleagues, Daniel's extended family, my cousin Kevin, all people who'd chosen to be there because they cared. I noticed Richard and Patricia sitting near the back, their faces unreadable, but I pushed the observation away. They'd come. That had to mean something. The reception started beautifully. The bell tower looked stunning, transformed by Amanda's meticulous planning into a warm, sophisticated space that felt both elegant and intimate. The band played while guests mingled, the food was exceptional, and the energy was joyful. Daniel and I had our first dance to a jazz standard we both loved, and I felt wrapped in happiness. Linda and Robert danced nearby, beaming at us. Amanda caught my eye from across the room, giving me a thumbs up that made me laugh. Kevin came up to congratulate us properly, hugging me tight and whispering that I deserved every bit of happiness. For those first 2 hours, everything was perfect. I barely saw Richard and Patricia, though I noticed they'd positioned themselves at a table in the corner, nursing drinks and not mingling with other guests. Patricia had worn black to my wedding, which felt like a statement in itself, but I refused to let it dim my mood. Daniel and I were talking with some of his teacher friends, laughing about stories from his classroom, when I noticed Amanda's expression change across the room. She was standing near the entrance, her face suddenly pale, her body rigid. She looked at her phone, then at the doors, then at me, and I watched panic flash across her features. Before I could move toward her, before I could ask what was wrong, the main doors to the reception space burst open with a force that made several guests jump. The live band faltered mid-song, instruments trailing off awkwardly as everyone turned toward the commotion. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. 3 people entered the venue, and it took my brain several seconds to process what I was seeing because it was so utterly wrong, so completely out of place in the elegant space we'd created. 2 women and 1 man, dressed in what could only be described as stripper costumes, strutted into my wedding reception with professional showmanship. 1 woman wore a police officer costume that was basically a bra and tiny shorts with a plastic badge. The other was dressed as a nurse in an outfit so revealing it left nothing to imagination. The man was shirtless with bow tie and cuffs, his pants hanging dangerously low. They carried a portable speaker that immediately began blasting bass-heavy club music that clashed violently with the jazz standards we'd carefully selected. The shift in atmosphere was instantaneous and jarring, like someone had taken a beautiful painting and thrown paint across it. My first reaction was confusion, so profound I couldn't move. This had to be a mistake. Someone had gotten the wrong venue. This was meant for a bachelor party down the street. My brain scrambled for any explanation that made sense because what was happening couldn't possibly be connected to my wedding. Daniel's hand tightened on mine, his face a mirror of my own shock. Amanda was already moving, her planner instincts kicking in as she rushed toward the performers, clearly trying to redirect them before they got further into the space. But she was too late. They were already in, already performing, already turning my elegant reception into a spectacle. The performers moved through the room with practiced choreography, approaching guests who recoiled in surprise and discomfort. My grandmother clutched her pearls literally, her face flushed with embarrassment. Daniel's mother looked horrified, turning away from the nearly naked people gyrating near her table. My colleagues from Horizon stood frozen, unsure whether this was some kind of avant-garde entertainment choice or a catastrophic mistake. The music pounded, completely drowning out the band we'd hired, and I watched the beautiful atmosphere we'd created dissolve into chaos. Some guests laughed nervously, unsure how to react. Others looked appalled. Many pulled out phones, and I realized with sinking horror that this moment was being recorded, documented, spread across social media in real time. I started moving toward Amanda, desperate to help her remove these people from my wedding, when I heard my mother's voice cut through the chaos. Patricia had stood up from her corner table, and she wasn't rushing to help. She wasn't expressing shock or confusion. Instead, she was walking toward the center of the room with Richard beside her, and they were smiling. Not small, uncomfortable smiles. Wide, satisfied grins that made my blood run cold. Patricia raised her voice, projecting across the room with the authority of someone making an announcement. And what she said next shattered whatever remained of my composure. "Everyone, please don't be alarmed. Victoria requested this special entertainment herself." Patricia's voice rang out, clear and deliberate. She wanted something memorable, something wild to spice up the evening. We were surprised by the request, but you know Victoria, always looking for attention, always trying to shock people. She laughed, a tinkling sound that carried false indulgence, as if she were a patient mother accommodating her difficult child's bizarre whims. Richard nodded beside her, his face arranged in an expression of bemused tolerance, playing the role of the father who'd learned to accept his daughter's outrageous behavior. The room fell into a stunned silence beneath the pounding music. Heads swiveled from the performers to Patricia to me, and I felt the weight of collective judgment crash over me like a physical force. My mouth opened but no sound came out. My brain couldn't process what I'd just heard because it was so fundamentally, viciously untrue. I had never requested this. I would never request this. Every detail of this wedding had been carefully planned to reflect elegance and intimacy, from the jazz band to the sophisticated menu to the tasteful decorations. The idea that I would sabotage my own event with strippers was so absurd it would have been laughable if it wasn't being publicly declared by my own mother. Daniel found his voice before I found mine. "That's not true," he said loudly, his teacher voice carrying across the space. "We didn't arrange this. This isn't part of our wedding." He looked at me, confusion and anger warring on his face, and I saw the question there. "You didn't, right?" The fact that he had to confirm, even for a second, sent a spike of pain through my chest. Amanda was shouting at the performers now, demanding to know who hired them, trying to physically direct them toward the exit. Security guards from the venue had finally appeared and were assisting her, but the damage was done. The performers, realizing something was wrong, tried to explain they'd been hired through a booking agency, that someone had paid them and given them this address and time. I finally forced words out, my voice shaking with shock and rising fury. "I didn't hire them. I would never hire them. This isn't mine." I looked directly at Patricia, whose satisfied smile hadn't wavered. "Why would you say that? Why would you lie?" The question came out plaintive, almost childlike, because even after everything, even after years of proof that my parents didn't love me the way parents should, this felt like a new level of cruelty I hadn't imagined possible. Patricia's expression shifted to mock innocence, her eyebrows raising as if I'd said something confusing. "Darling, don't be embarrassed. You told us weeks ago you wanted something unconventional. You said the wedding was too stuffy, too boring, that you wanted to shake things up. We were just trying to support your vision, even though we thought it was inappropriate." Her voice dripped with false concern, the implication clear to everyone listening. She was painting me as the difficult daughter, the attention seeker who made outrageous requests and then pretended innocence when they backfired. Richard nodded along, backing her story with his silence and complicit presence. The music finally cut off as Amanda successfully ushered the performers out, security trailing behind them. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the chaos had been. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid, could feel my heart slamming against my ribs. Daniel's arm wrapped around my waist, anchoring me, and I felt him trembling with anger. His mother Linda had tears streaming down her face, not from joy anymore but from outrage on my behalf. Robert looked like he wanted to physically remove Richard and Patricia from the building. Kevin was already on his feet, moving toward me with protective urgency. Amanda returned, her face flushed, her professional composure cracked. She walked straight to me and said quietly, "They were hired 3 days ago. The booking was made under your name, but the credit card used was Patricia's." I saw the receipt. She held up her phone, showing me the confirmation email the performers had forwarded when she demanded proof of their hire. There it was in black and white. A booking made in my name with detailed instructions about the venue and timing, paid for with a credit card that belonged to my mother. The evidence was irrefutable. This hadn't been a mistake or a misunderstanding. This had been planned, orchestrated, executed with deliberate precision. The room remained frozen, guests unsure whether to stay or leave, whether to pretend they hadn't witnessed what just happened or acknowledge the disaster head-on. I looked around at faces I cared about, people I'd invited to share in my joy, and saw confusion, pity, secondhand embarrassment. My wedding, the day I'd dreamed about and planned for and hoped would finally be something my parents celebrated, had been turned into a humiliating spectacle. And they had done it on purpose. They had paid money, made arrangements, coordinated timing, all to sabotage my reception, and then publicly blame me for it. I turned back to Patricia and Richard, still standing in the center of the room like performers waiting for applause. "Why?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper, but in the silence of the room, everyone heard it. "Why would you do this?" Patricia's mask of innocence slipped for just a second, and I saw what lay beneath. Satisfaction. Cold, calculated satisfaction. This wasn't about my wedding being too boring or unconventional. This was punishment. This was their way of reminding me that I didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve celebration, didn't deserve a day that was about me instead of Marcus. Richard spoke for the first time since the chaos began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of dismissive authority. "You're being dramatic, Victoria. It was meant to be fun. Maybe if you'd chosen a more traditional path, had a more respectable career, we wouldn't have thought you'd appreciate this kind of entertainment. But you've always been so focused on attention, on being different, we assumed this fit your brand." The words were chosen carefully, each one designed to humiliate. He was connecting my career in social media and marketing, my choice to build something creative and modern, to a supposed desire for trashy entertainment. He was saying I'd brought this on myself by not being the daughter they wanted. Something cracked inside me in that moment. Something that had been bending and straining under the weight of their rejection for 29 years. I felt Daniel's arm tighten around me, felt Amanda's hand on my shoulder, felt the support of my chosen family surrounding me physically. And I realized that no matter what I said, no matter how I defended myself, Richard and Patricia would never see me as anything other than their disappointment. They had sabotaged my wedding, humiliated me in front of everyone I cared about, lied about it publicly, and they felt justified. They felt righteous. Because in their world, I didn't deserve better. The guests began to murmur, conversations starting quietly as people processed what they'd witnessed. I heard fragments of support, friends whispering that this was clearly not my doing, that something was seriously wrong with my parents. But I also heard the gossip starting, the way stories get twisted and spread. By tomorrow, some version of this disaster would be circulating through Nashville's social circles, and I knew how these things worked. The truth wouldn't matter as much as the spectacle. The image of strippers at Victoria Bennett's wedding would stick, regardless of whose fault it actually was. Linda approached Patricia, her sweet face transformed by protective anger. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking. "How dare you ruin your daughter's wedding? This is disgusting. This is unforgivable." Patricia looked at Linda like she was an insect, barely worth acknowledging, and said something I couldn't hear. But I saw Linda's face go white, saw Robert move to her side, and I knew whatever Patricia had said was vicious. Richard and Patricia gathered their things, preparing to leave as if they'd simply attended an event that hadn't met their standards, rather than demolished it themselves. Before they could make their exit, Kevin stepped in front of them. "Everyone saw what you did," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Everyone knows you paid for those performers. Everyone heard you lie about Victoria requesting them. You can leave, but you can't pretend this didn't happen." Richard tried to brush past him, but Kevin didn't move. "You've treated her like garbage her entire life, and tonight, you proved exactly who you are to everyone watching. I hope it was worth it." Patricia's composure finally cracked, her face flushing with anger. Stay out of family business, Kevin. You've always been bitter because your side of the family never amounted to anything. Victoria knows what she did to deserve this. Those words hung in the air, confirmation of what I'd always suspected but hoped wasn't true. In her mind, I deserved this punishment. I deserved humiliation. Because I wasn't Marcus, wasn't the golden child, wasn't what they'd wanted. They left, walking out of the bell tower with their heads high, leaving behind a reception in ruins and a daughter destroyed. The doors closed behind them, and for a long moment, nobody moved. Then Amanda was there, professional mask back in place, trying to salvage what remained of the evening. The band tentatively started playing again. Servers began circulating with drinks. People slowly returned to conversations, though the energy had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer a joyful celebration. It was a wake for my relationship with my parents, witnessed by everyone I knew. Daniel pulled me close, and I finally broke. Tears came in waves, silent and hot, soaking into his tuxedo jacket as he held me in the middle of our reception. "I'm so sorry," I kept whispering, apologizing for my parents, for the chaos, for the ruined evening. He just held me tighter, murmuring that none of this was my fault, that we'd get through it, that our marriage was what mattered. Linda and Robert formed a protective circle around us, blocking me from the curious stares. Amanda disappeared and returned with my purse and wrap, gently suggesting we could leave early if I wanted to, that she'd handle everything else. But I didn't want to leave. Walking out would mean letting Richard and Patricia win, letting them destroy not just my reception, but my marriage's first hours. So I stayed. I dried my tears, fixed my makeup, and made myself return to the celebration. Daniel stayed beside me every moment, his presence steady and grounding. We cut the cake, we danced to our last song. We thanked guests who were kind enough to pretend the last hour hadn't happened. Kevin gave a toast that addressed the chaos obliquely, talking about chosen family, and the courage it takes to build a life with people who truly value you. It was clear who he was talking about, and the room responded with supportive applause. As the evening finally wound down and guests began leaving, many stopped to hug me, to whisper words of support, to express their outrage at what they'd witnessed. My colleagues from Horizon promised that nothing about tonight would affect how they saw me professionally. Daniel's teacher friends assured us that everyone knew this wasn't our doing. Linda held my face in her hands and told me I was her daughter now, that she'd never let anyone hurt me like that again. The kindness helped, but it couldn't erase what had happened. Amanda and I stood in the venue's entry as the last guests trickled out, looking at the beautiful space we'd created, now associated forever with humiliation instead of joy. "I have the receipts," she said quietly. "The booking confirmation, the credit card information, everything. If you want to pursue this legally, we have proof." I nodded numbly, not sure what I wanted except for the night to be over. She hugged me fiercely, promising she'd handle all the vendor payments and cleanup, insisting Daniel and I just leave and try to salvage our wedding night. Daniel drove us to the hotel where we'd planned to stay before flying out for our honeymoon the next morning. We didn't talk during the drive, both of us too emotionally exhausted for words. In the hotel room, still in our wedding attire, we finally looked at each other and the absurdity of it all hit us simultaneously. We started laughing, not joyful laughter but the kind that comes when shock gives way to disbelief. "Did that actually happen?" I asked, and Daniel nodded, pulling me into his arms. "It did, and it was horrible, and your parents are terrible people, and I love you, and we're married, and that's what matters." He was right, but it didn't stop the pain. As we finally changed out of our wedding clothes, as I carefully hung the dress I'd been so excited to wear, I looked at my phone for the first time in hours. There were texts from friends offering support, messages from relatives I barely knew expressing shock, and several notifications from social media. Against my better judgment, I looked. The videos had already started circulating. Clips of the strippers entering, of Patricia's announcement, of the chaos. The comments ranged from supportive to curious to judgmental. Some people defended me, others speculated about what kind of person hires strippers for their own wedding, regardless of the explanation that followed. The narrative was already being written, and I had no control over it. I showed Daniel, and he took the phone from my hands, powered it off and set it aside. "Not tonight," he said firmly. Tomorrow we can deal with fallout. Tonight, we're just going to be married. So we sat together on the hotel bed, still processing, and talked about what came next. Because I knew with absolute certainty that this couldn't continue. Richard and Patricia had crossed a line so far beyond acceptable that there was no coming back. They hadn't just skipped my wedding or said something hurtful. They had actively, deliberately destroyed it, humiliated me publicly, and then lied to make it seem like my own doing. The anger finally came then, replacing the shock and hurt. How dare they? How dare they take a day that was supposed to be about love and commitment and turn it into a weapon against me? How dare they spend money and time plotting this humiliation? How dare they stand in that room, surrounded by evidence of their cruelty, and feel justified? Every memory of my childhood clicked into place with new clarity. This wasn't new behavior. It was just the most extreme version of what they'd always done. Make me small to make Marcus look bigger, punish me for not fitting their mold, ensure I knew my place in the family hierarchy. Daniel watched my expression change, saw the anger harden into resolution, and asked what I was thinking. "I'm done," I said, the words coming out clear and certain. "I've spent my entire life trying to earn their love, their respect, their basic acknowledgement. Tonight proved I never will. They don't want to see me succeed or be happy. They want me to fail, to be embarrassed, to know that I'll never measure up. I'm done giving them the power to hurt me." He nodded, supporting whatever decision I made, promising we'd face whatever came next together. We tried to sleep, but my mind raced with replays of the evening. Patricia's satisfied smile, Richard's dismissive tone, the looks on my guests' faces, the videos spreading online, the realization that tomorrow, when we were supposed to be relaxing into our honeymoon, I'd instead be doing damage control. But more than that, I thought about what came after the honeymoon. Because Richard and Patricia had made their intentions clear. This wasn't about one bad moment. This was about their fundamental belief that I deserved to be treated as lesser, as disposable, as a permanent disappointment. And I was finally ready to accept that nothing I did would ever change their minds. The honeymoon in Charleston was supposed to be a week of exploring historic streets, eating at wonderful restaurants, and celebrating the start of our marriage. Instead, the first 3 days were consumed by crisis management. I couldn't ignore what had happened, couldn't pretend the videos weren't spreading, couldn't avoid the messages flooding my phone once I finally turned it back on. The morning after the wedding, sitting in our hotel room overlooking the Charleston harbor, I made the decision to address it head-on rather than let the narrative spiral completely out of my control. Daniel sat beside me as I drafted a statement for my social media accounts, both personal and professional. I kept it factual and brief, explaining that the entertainment at my reception was not requested by me or my husband, that it was arranged without our knowledge or consent, and that we were as shocked as our guests. I didn't name Richard and Patricia directly, but I didn't need to. Anyone who'd been there knew exactly who was responsible, and those who hadn't been there could read between the lines. Within an hour of posting, the response was overwhelming. Friends, colleagues, even acquaintances came forward with support, sharing their own stories of family dysfunction, expressing outrage on my behalf, validating that what happened was not normal or acceptable. Amanda called that afternoon, her voice tight with controlled anger. She'd spent the morning fielding questions from vendors who'd heard about the chaos, and she wanted me to know that every single person she'd spoken to had expressed sympathy and offered their support. The band had sent a message saying they'd be willing to testify if I pursued any legal action about the disruption. The photographer, who'd captured the entire disaster on camera, had offered to provide me with any images I needed as evidence while promising not to share the more humiliating shots publicly. Even the bell tower's management had reached out to apologize for the security lapse and offer a partial refund. The professional community was rallying around me, which helped soften the sting of what had happened. But the vindication from strangers and colleagues didn't erase the fundamental betrayal. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, kept seeing Patricia's satisfied smile, kept hearing her voice announcing that I'd requested the entertainment. The calculated cruelty of it was staggering. They hadn't acted in anger or made a spontaneous bad decision. They'd planned this. Days in advance, they'd researched entertainment services, made phone calls, provided credit card information, given specific instructions about timing and location. Every step had been deliberate, every detail designed for maximum humiliation. This wasn't a parent disappointed in their child's choices. This was active, intentional destruction. Daniel tried to distract me, suggesting we explore the city, visit plantations, take a boat tour, anything to reclaim some joy from what was supposed to be our honeymoon. We went through the motions, walking hand in hand through historic neighborhoods, eating she crab soup and shrimp and grits at recommended restaurants, watching the sunset from Waterfront Park. The city was beautiful, the weather perfect, and my new husband was endlessly patient and supportive. But I couldn't fully be present. Part of my mind was always back in that reception space, reliving the horror, processing the implications. On the fourth day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was male, professional, introducing himself as Gregory Chin, an attorney with a family law practice in Nashville. He explained that he'd been at my wedding as a guest of one of Daniel's colleagues, that he'd witnessed everything that happened, and that if I was interested in pursuing legal options regarding what he termed intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation, he'd be willing to consult with me at no charge. His offer was unexpected and touching. Another stranger offering support when my own parents had offered only cruelty. I thanked him and said I'd think about it, though I wasn't sure legal action was the path I wanted to take. What would it accomplish? Money wouldn't undo the humiliation. A court ruling wouldn't make Richard and Patricia suddenly love or respect me. But having the option, knowing that what they'd done was potentially actionable in a legal sense, validated that my reaction wasn't an overreaction. This wasn't just hurt feelings over a family disagreement. This was something objectively harmful, something so far outside the bounds of acceptable behavior that a lawyer I'd never met was willing to help me address it. Daniel and I talked for hours that night about what came next. He didn't push me toward any particular decision, just listened as I worked through my thoughts aloud. Part of me wanted to confront Richard and Patricia directly, to demand an explanation and an apology. But the larger, wiser part of me knew that confrontation would be pointless. They'd already shown me who they were. Patricia's parting words to Kevin, her claim that I'd done something to deserve their sabotage, revealed their fundamental belief system. In their minds, I was the problem. My existence as someone other than who they wanted me to be was justification enough for punishment. What hurt almost as much as their actions was the silence from Marcus. My brother, who'd been copied on every wedding update, who'd received an invitation, who'd been informed of the date months in advance, hadn't attended. He'd sent a generic congratulations text the week before and nothing since. Even after the videos started circulating, even after the story spread through our extended family, Marcus hadn't called to check on me or express concern. His silence was its own message. He was either complicit in Richard and Patricia's cruelty, or so absorbed in his own life that his sister's public humiliation didn't register as important. Either option confirmed what I'd always known but tried to deny. I didn't have a brother, not in any meaningful sense. I had a stranger who shared my DNA and benefited from being the favorite. Kevin called regularly during the honeymoon, updating me on family fallout I hadn't asked about but needed to hear. Apparently, the extended family was divided. Some relatives, the ones who'd always been closer to Richard and Patricia, were defending them or at least remaining neutral, claiming there must be more to the story. But others, including Kevin's parents and several aunts and uncles, were furious. They'd seen the videos, heard the accounts from multiple guests, and were appalled. Kevin's mother, my father's sister, had apparently called Richard and told him he should be ashamed of himself, that what he and Patricia had done was unforgivable. Richard had hung up on her. The family gossip should have felt vindicating, but mostly it just felt exhausting. I didn't want to be at the center of family drama. I didn't want to be the victim everyone pitied, or the controversial figure people took sides over. I just wanted to be a newlywed enjoying her honeymoon, planning her future, thinking about anything other than her parents' cruelty. But that option had been taken from me the moment Patricia booked those performers. By the end of the week, as Daniel and I packed to return to Nashville, I'd made some preliminary decisions. I wasn't going to pursue legal action, not because Richard and Patricia didn't deserve it, but because I didn't want to extend this nightmare any further. I wasn't going to post any more about it publicly, wasn't going to feed the drama or give people more to gossip about. But I also wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened, or accept any attempts at reconciliation that didn't include genuine accountability. I was going to protect myself, protect my marriage, and build the life I wanted without waiting for permission or approval from people who'd proven they'd never give it. The flight home was quiet, both of us lost in thought. Landing in Nashville felt surreal, like returning to a different version of my life than the one I'd left. The wedding was over, the honeymoon was over, and now came the hard part. Actually living with the consequences of what had happened. Figuring out how to move forward when your parents had publicly demonstrated their contempt for you. Daniel held my hand during the descent, and I was grateful beyond words that whatever else happened, I had him. I had someone who'd chosen me completely, who'd stood beside me through the worst moment of my life and hadn't wavered. We got home to our apartment in East Nashville to find it filled with flowers. Amanda had apparently coordinated with building management to let delivery people in, and our living room looked like a botanical garden. Cards from friends, colleagues, Daniel's family, even some of my clients, all expressing support and love. Linda had left a casserole in our fridge with heating instructions, and a note saying she loved me. Robert had dropped off a bottle of expensive whiskey with a card that simply said, "For when you need it." The tangible evidence of our chosen family's care made me cry again, but this time the tears weren't from pain. They were from gratitude. That first week back was an adjustment. I had to return to work, face colleagues who'd witnessed the disaster, navigate conversations about my wedding that inevitably circled back to what everyone was really thinking about. But Horizon's leadership was incredible. My direct supervisor pulled me aside the first day and said that if anyone made me uncomfortable or brought up the incident inappropriately, I should report it immediately. The company valued me and my work, and they weren't going to let office gossip undermine my position. That support meant everything, allowing me to focus on my actual job rather than worrying about my professional reputation. Daniel returned to his classroom, and his students apparently greeted him with cards they'd made, having heard through the teacher grapevine that something had gone wrong at his wedding. The simple kindness of teenagers who barely knew him, offering support because they sensed he needed it, restored some of my faith in human nature. We fell into a routine, cooking dinner together, taking evening walks, talking through our feelings, slowly building normalcy after chaos. But 2 weeks after we returned from Charleston, Richard called. I saw his name on my phone screen, and my stomach dropped. Daniel was beside me on the couch, and I showed him the incoming call, asking without words what I should do. He left the decision to me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to block the number and never speak to either parent again. But I answered, needing to know what he possibly had to say after everything that had happened. His voice was casual, almost friendly, as if nothing had occurred. He asked how the honeymoon was, commented on the weather, mentioned that he and Patricia had been busy with country club commitments. The normalcy of his tone was disorienting, making me question whether the wedding disaster had even happened. Then he got to the point. Marcus and Stephanie were getting married in 6 months, planning a large ceremony at the country club. Richard said they were expecting my help with marketing the event, since I was supposedly so good at that social media stuff. He wanted me to create promotional materials, manage their wedding hashtag, coordinate with vendors on branding. He presented it as if he were offering me an opportunity, a chance to contribute to the family in a meaningful way. I sat there speechless, my mind struggling to process the audacity. They'd sabotaged my wedding 2 weeks ago, and now they wanted me to work for free on Marcus's. Not only that, but Richard's phrasing made it clear this wasn't a request. It was an expectation. An assumption that of course I'd drop everything to support the Golden Child's event. There was no apology for what had happened at my reception, no acknowledgement that anything wrong had occurred, no concern about how I was coping with the aftermath. Just a demand disguised as a favor. When I didn't respond immediately, Richard's tone shifted slightly, taking on an edge of impatience. He said that family helps family, that Marcus had always been there for me, which was a lie so blatant I almost laughed. He suggested that contributing to the wedding would be good for my business, that the exposure at a high-end country club event could lead to new clients. He was trying every angle: obligation, reciprocity, self-interest, anything to manipulate me into compliance. And beneath it all was the unspoken threat that refusal would confirm what they'd always believed, that I was selfish, difficult, not a team player. Something crystallized in that moment. This was who they were. This was who they would always be. People who could destroy my wedding, humiliate me publicly, cause me genuine trauma, and then 2 weeks later ask for my professional services as if nothing had happened. People who saw me only as a resource to be used for Marcus's benefit, never as a person deserving of basic respect or consideration. Richard's call wasn't about the wedding. It was a test, a way of determining whether I'd learned my lesson, whether I was going to fall back in line and accept my role as the family's lesser child. I thought about all the times I'd complied with similar demands, all the times I'd swallowed hurt and showed up anyway, hoping that eventually my cooperation would earn their love. I thought about the art show they'd skipped, the award ceremony they'd missed, the business article they'd barely acknowledged. I thought about Patricia's satisfied smile as she lied to my wedding guests. I thought about the videos still circulating online, the damage to my reputation that I was still managing, the therapy appointments I'd already scheduled because the trauma of that night wasn't something I could just shake off. And I thought about the life I was building with Daniel, the career I'd worked so hard for, the chosen family who'd surrounded me with love when my biological family had failed. I thought about the future I wanted, one where I wasn't constantly bracing for the next rejection or humiliation, one where my worth wasn't determined by whether Richard and Patricia finally decided I was good enough. I thought about the daughter Daniel and I might have someday, and whether I wanted her to watch me accept mistreatment from people who should love me. What kind of example would that set? My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady and cold. I told Richard no. I would not be providing any services for Marcus's wedding. I would not be attending Marcus's wedding. In fact, I would not be having any further contact with him, Patricia, or Marcus. I said that what they did at my wedding was unforgivable, that his call today without any apology or acknowledgement made it clear they felt no remorse, and that I was done subjecting myself to their cruelty. I said I was not the family's unpaid labor, not their scapegoat, not their disappointment to manage. I was a successful, accomplished adult who deserved better than how they'd treated me for 29 years. Richard's response was immediate and volcanic. His voice rose, calling me ungrateful, selfish, dramatic. He said I was ruining the family with my attitude, that I'd always been difficult, that they'd done their best with me despite my problems. He claimed they'd been trying to loosen up my uptight wedding, that it was meant as a gift, a way to make the event more fun. The gaslighting was so blatant it would have been impressive if it wasn't so damaging. He was rewriting history in real time, transforming their calculated cruelty into misunderstood generosity. I didn't argue or defend myself. I simply said that our conversation was over and hung up. Then I blocked his number. I pulled up my contacts, found Patricia and Marcus, and blocked them too. The action felt both enormous and anticlimactic. 3 taps on my phone screen, and I'd cut off contact with my entire immediate family. Daniel watched me do it, his face reflecting support and concern in equal measure. When I finished, he asked how I felt. I told him the truth, terrified and free at the same time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.